The spinal cord is like a highway that enables a two-way communication between the brain and other parts of the body. It contains neural pathways called spinal cord pathways or simply spinal tracts, which can be either ascending or descending. Both types of tracts are made up of neuronal axons that gather into long columns called funiculi, which are found inside the ventral, lateral, and dorsal aspects of the spinal cord. Here, we'll focus on the ascending tracts, which are sensory pathways carrying sensory information from the body, like pain, up the spinal cord to the brain. Now, let's start by looking at the anatomy of the spinal cord. Anteriorly, there is a deep midline depression called the ventral median fissure, and posteriorly, there is a more shallow midline depression called the dorsal median sulcus. Each half also has a ventrolateral sulcus, where ventral rootlets leave the spinal cord, and a dorsolateral sulcus, where dorsal rootlets enter the spinal cord. The ventral and dorsal rootlets fuse to form the ventral and dorsal roots, respectively. Ventral rootlets and roots carry motor fibers that travel from the spinal cord to different organs and muscles, while their dorsal counterparts, with a sensory ganglion called the dorsal root ganglion attached to each dorsal root, carry sensory fibers from organs and receptors throughout the body to the spinal cord. Now, on a transverse section, the spinal cord has an area of gray matter shaped like a capital H in the middle. The gray matter is subdivided into the gray commissure, which is the strip connecting the two halves of the spinal cord that surrounds the central canal, and the peripheral regions, known as horns. There are two ventral and two dorsal horns. Dorsal horns contain neuronal cell bodies that process information received from sensory fibers, entering the spinal cord from the dorsal roots and dorsal rootlets. On the other hand, the ventral horns contain cell bodies of motor neurons, with motor fibers exiting through the ventral rootlets and ventral roots. Now, the gray matter in the T1 through L3 spinal cord segments has a small lateral projection known as the lateral horn. The lateral horn is located between the dorsal and ventral horns and contains the cell bodies of preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, which mediates the fight-or-flight response, including increasing heart rate and dilating bronchioles to increase air intake. The gray matter is surrounded by white matter, which consists of bundles of axons that carry information to and from the brain. These axons are organized into bundles called tracts or pathways. Now, let's take a closer look at the ascending tracts. They begin at the spinal cord and travel in the white matter all the way up to the brain. Most of these pathways are made up of a 3-neuron chain that terminate on neurons in the cerebral cortex. These cell bodies in the cerebral cortex can be considered the 4th neuron. The first-order neurons are those found inside dorsal root ganglia. These neurons gather sensory input from different receptors, such as touch or pressure receptors, and send it to the second-order neurons found inside the spinal cord or brainstem. Second-order neurons then transmit the information to the third-order neurons located inside the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays the information to the cell bodies in the cerebral cortex, the fourth-order neurons. While climbing up through the spinal cord to the brain, most ascending tracts cross over to the opposite side of the central nervous system, meaning that the left side of the brain receives sensory input from the right side of the body, and vice versa. These crossings are called decussations, and they happen at different levels of the CNS for each of these tracts. Now, there are several ascending tracts to look at in the spinal cord's white matter. First, there is the dorsal column, which carries sensations like fine or discriminative touch, vibration, and proprioception, meaning sensing the position of body parts in space. Another tract is the spinothalamic tract, which consists of the lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts. In general, the spinothalamic tract transmits information such as pressure sensations, crude touch, pain, and temperature sensations. There is also the spinocerebellar tract, which is also divided into the anterior spinocerebellar and the posterior spinocerebellar tracts. Just like the dorsal column, the spinocerebellar tract transmits proprioceptive sensory information. The difference is that the spinocerebellar tract is mainly in charge of unconscious proprioception, like the amount of stretch in our muscles or the degree of flexion in our knees or elbows, which enables us to maintain posture and produce movements. Let's take a deep dive into ascending tracts, starting with the dorsal column, known fully as the dorsal column medial lemniscus, or DCML, pathway. This is a sensory pathway that transmits delicate, discriminative sensations like vibration, pressure, proprioception, and two-point discrimination, which is the ability to tell if two different points on your body are being touched at the same time. All this is made possible by receptors like mechanoreceptors found throughout the skin that sense touch, or proprioceptors, like the muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs located in muscles and joints that sense body position. When these receptors are stimulated, impulses are sent along peripheral nerves that are made of the axons of first-order neurons. These axons travel to the dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies of these first-order neurons reside. From these ganglia, short axons enter the ipsilateral dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, forming the dorsal column. The dorsal column is divided into two parts. One is the fasciculus gracilis, which is located throughout the length of the spinal cord and is situated in the medial part of the dorsal column in the upper thoracic and cervical segments. The fasciculus gracilis contains axons carrying sensations from the lower parts of the body, generally from T7 and below. So it contains ascending fibers from the sacral, lumbar, and lower thoracic spinal nerves. The second part of the dorsal column is the fasciculus cuneatus, which, starting at about T7, is located in the lateral part of the dorsal column. The fasciculus cuneatus contains ascending fibers carrying sensations from the upper parts of the body. Both the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus ascend in the ipsilateral spinal cord to the medulla, where the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus are located. This is where both fasciculi terminate after their fibers synapse with the cell bodies of these second-order neurons. Second-order neuronal axons now decussate and form a pathway called the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus ascends to the thalamus, more specifically to the ventral posterolateral, or VPL, nucleus, where the fibers synapse on the cell bodies of the third-order neurons. Finally, the third-order neuronal axons from the thalamus ascend towards the cerebrum through the internal capsule to the primary somatosensory cortex, where they terminate on the fourth-order neurons, the final destination for the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Now, let's take a quick break and see if you can remember which component of the dorsal column medial lemniscus carries information from the lower body. Next, let's look at the spinothalamic system, which includes the spinothalamic tract as well as the spinomesencephalic, spinotectal, and spinoreticular tracts, which are collaterals, or offshoots, of the spinothalamic tract. Note that the spinothalamic system is also referred to as the anterolateral system because of its position within the white matter of the spinal cord. Let's explore the spinothalamic tract first. Information transmitted in this pathway begins in the periphery, travels to the spinal cord, and then all the way up to the thalamus and finally to the primary somatosensory cortex. The spinothalamic tract is divided into the anterior spinothalamic tract, which transmits pressure sensations and crude touch, and the lateral spinothalamic tract, which conveys pain and temperature sensations. The first-order neurons of the spinothalamic tract originate from receptors within the skin. The impulse travels within peripheral nerves to the dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies of the first-order sensory neurons are located. Then the signal enters the spinal cord, where the axons of the anterior tract don't actually synapse right away, but first ascend one or two spinal levels before synapsing with the second-order neuronal cell bodies located in the ipsilateral dorsal horn of the gray matter. On the other hand, the first-order neurons of the lateral tract typically synapse right away with the second-order neurons at the same level they enter the spinal cord. The axons of the second-order neurons decussate via the anterior white commissure of the spinal cord, and then both anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts ascend through the contralateral white matter of the spinal cord to the thalamus, specifically to the ventral posterolateral, or VPL, nucleus, where they terminate by synapsing with the third-order neurons within this nucleus. As the lateral spinothalamic tract ascends through the spinal cord, new fibers are added to the anteromedial aspect of the tract. As a result, the sacral and lumbar fibers are located more posterior and laterally, whereas the thoracic and cervical fibers are somewhat more anterior and medial. From the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, it's pretty much the same for both tracts. The third-order neuronal axons ascend toward the cerebrum through the internal capsule to the primary somatosensory cortex, where they synapse on the fourth-order neurons. Now let's explore the collaterals of the spinothalamic tract. First, we have the spinomesencephalic tract, which carries information about pain to the brainstem, specifically the periaqueductal gray of the midbrain. The first-order neuronal axons of this tract enter the spinal cord from the dorsal root ganglion, travel to the gray matter where they synapse on the cell bodies of its second-order neurons. Axons of the second-order neurons of this tract then decussate and ascend in the anterolateral white column, terminating by synapsing with neurons in the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray then initiates a cascade of synapses that terminates back on neurons within the spinal cord. This tract and system is important in helping to inhibit or control painful sensations. There are also collaterals that terminate in the superior colliculus within the tectum of the midbrain through the spinotectal tract. The superior colliculus is an important visual reflex center, with the spinotectal tract providing afferent information that results in reflexive eye and head movements toward the site of painful stimuli. Next is the spino-reticular tract. Its first-order neurons enter the spinal cord from the dorsal root ganglion and enter the gray matter, where they synapse with the cell bodies of the second-order neurons. Second-order neuronal axons of this tract ascend in the lateral white column, mixed with axons of the lateral spinothalamic tract. Most of the fibers of the spino-reticular tract do not decussate. They terminate by synapsing with the cell bodies of neurons within the reticular formation in the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Since the reticular formation plays a role in alertness and attention, the spino-reticular tract plays a role in directing attention towards painful stimuli. Alright, let's take another pause. But in the meantime, what is the function of the lateral spinothalamic tract? The last of the ascending pathways are the spinocerebellar tracts. Of the three tracts that send proprioceptive information to the cerebellum, there are two that are prominent in the white matter of the spinal cord, the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. These are sensory pathways that send unconscious proprioception to the cerebellum, which in turn helps to maintain posture and coordinate voluntary movement. The signals on these pathways originate in proprioceptive receptors such as muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, and then travel along first-order neuronal axons of peripheral nerves. The signal enters the dorsal root ganglion and then the spinal cord, where there's a synapse with second-order neurons located in the ipsilateral gray matter. The fibers either decussate right away and create the anterior spinocerebellar tract just lateral to the lateral spinothalamic tract, or they remain on the ipsilateral side to form the posterior spinocerebellar tract. The anterior spinocerebellar tract ascends to the superior cerebellar peduncle, passing through it and then decussating again before arriving at the ipsilateral cerebellar cortex, where it synapses on neurons there. On the other hand, the posterior spinocerebellar tract doesn't decussate. Instead, it ascends to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, passes through it, and arrives at the ipsilateral cerebellar cortex as well, ending its journey by synapsing on neurons in the cortex. So, compared to other sensory tracts, spinocerebellar tracts have a 3-neuron chain and transmit information ipsilaterally between the body and the cerebellum, whereas other ascending tracts are contralateral in their target. Okay, one last question before we recap. What is the function of the spinotectal tract? Alright, as a quick recap, ascending tracts are sensory pathways that carry information received from various sensory receptors from the spinal cord up to the brain. Most ascending tracts consist of 3 to 4 successively connected neurons that terminate in the cerebral cortex. First-order neurons carry information from sensory receptors through the dorsal root ganglion, where their cell bodies are found, to second-order neurons located in the spinal cord or brainstem. These second-order neurons then transmit sensory information to the third-order neurons in the thalamus, and then the fourth-order neurons located in the cerebral cortex. The ascending tracts include the dorsal column, which transmits sensory information including vibration, conscious proprioception, and two-point discrimination. The dorsal column consists of the fasciculus gracilis carrying sensations from the lower half of the body, and the fasciculus cuneatus, which transmits sensory information from the upper half of the body. There is also the spinothalamic tract, which consists of the lateral spinothalamic and anterior spinothalamic tracts. The spinothalamic tract transmits information such as pressure, crude touch, pain, and temperature sensations. The spinothalamic tract includes as collateral tracts the spinomesencephalic tract, which helps in pain suppression, the spinotectal tract, which is involved in reflexive eye and head movements toward the site of painful stimuli, and the spinoreticular tract, which assists with attention to painful stimuli. The last ascending tracts are the spinocerebellar tracts, which carry unconscious proprioceptive information from voluntary musculature to the cerebellum. The spinal cord is like a highway that enables two-way communication between the brain and the rest of the body. It contains neural pathways, called spinal cord pathways or tracts, which either ascend or descend depending on the information they are carrying. Both types of tracts are made up of neuronal axons that gather into long columns, which are found inside the ventral, lateral, and dorsal aspects of the spinal cord. The descending tracts are the motor pathways that tell various muscles in the body to contract, like when lifting a heavy weight. Now, let's start by looking at the anatomy of the spinal cord. Anteriorly, there is a deep midline depression called the ventral median fissure, and posteriorly, there is a more shallow midline depression called the dorsal median sulcus. Each half also has a ventrolateral sulcus, where ventral rootlets leave the spinal cord, and a dorsolateral sulcus, where dorsal rootlets enter the spinal cord. The ventral and dorsal rootlets fuse to form the ventral and dorsal roots, respectively. Ventral rootlets and roots carry motor fibers that travel from the spinal cord to different organs and muscles, while their dorsal counterparts, with a sensory ganglion called the dorsal root ganglion attached to each dorsal root, carry sensory fibers from organs and receptors throughout the body to the spinal cord. Now, on a transverse section, the spinal cord has an area of gray matter shaped like a capital H in the middle. The gray matter is subdivided into the gray commissure, which is the strip connecting the two halves of the spinal cord that surrounds the central canal, and the peripheral regions known as horns. There are 2 ventral and 2 dorsal horns. Dorsal horns contain neuronal cell bodies that process information received from sensory fibers, entering the spinal cord from the dorsal roots and dorsal rootlets. On the other hand, the ventral horns contain cell bodies of motor neurons, with motor fibers exiting through the ventral rootlets and ventral roots. Alright, now let's look at the descending somatic motor pathways which control the activity of skeletal muscles. These pathways originate from either the cerebral cortex or the brainstem and have various termination points, depending on the pathway. Each pathway contains an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. The upper motor neurons are found inside the cerebral cortex and various nuclei of the brainstem, while lower motor neurons are found inside the brainstem or the ventral horn of the spinal cord. From the ventral horns, axons from lower motor neurons leave the spinal cord through the ventral roots and travel within peripheral nerves to innervate the skeletal muscles of the body. First up, there's the corticospinal tract, which is a motor pathway that runs from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, hence the name corticospinal. This tract is responsible for the voluntary movements of the limbs and trunk. The cell bodies of the first-order neurons of this pathway lie in the primary motor cortex. The axons then descend via the corona radiata through the internal capsule, the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain, and the ventral aspect of the pons to reach the ventral aspect of the medulla. At the medulla, these fibers bundle together and create swellings known as the pyramids, and the majority of the corticospinal fibers decussate or cross over to the opposite side at the level of the caudal medulla, in what's known as the pyramidal decussation. At this level, the corticospinal tract divides into the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. The decussated fibers form the lateral corticospinal tract, while the uncrossed fibers continue as the anterior corticospinal tract. Both the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts descend through the spinal cord. The lateral corticospinal tract continues through the contralateral lateral column of the spinal cord and synapse in the ventral horn on the lower motor neurons. Axons of the lower motor neurons leave the spinal cord through the ventral root to innervate muscles of the limbs, especially distal musculature that control fine movements. On a cross-section of the spinal cord, the lateral corticospinal tract is organized based on the region of the spinal cord it is supplying. From lateral to medial, it is organized into sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical fibers. So, axons that control motor innervation of the upper limbs terminate in the cervical region and are therefore located more medially, whereas axons that control lower limb movements terminate in the lumbar region and are more lateral. The anterior corticospinal tract descends uncrossed within the anterior column, with its fibers decussating only after they reach the desired spinal cord level, where they synapse with lower motor neurons in the ventral horn. These axons also leave the spinal cord through the ventral root to supply muscles of the trunk. Now let's talk about the reticulospinal tract, which originates from the reticular formation located in the pons and the medulla. Fibers that originate from the pons form the pontine reticulospinal tract, which descends to the spinal cord, mostly uncrossed. Fibers originating in the medulla form the medullary reticulospinal tract, which terminates in the spinal cord with a mix of crossed and uncrossed fibers. The fibers of the reticulospinal tract can either excite or inhibit motor neurons to influence voluntary movements, posture, and reflexes. Next is the tectospinal tract, also known as the colliculospinal tract, which originates in the superior colliculi of the dorsal midbrain. These fibers decussate and descend down the brainstem, enter the spinal cord, and synapse on interneurons in the ventral horns of the cervical region. Since the superior colliculi receive both visual and auditory information, the function of the tectospinal tract is to mediate postural reflexes of the head and neck in response to visual and auditory stimuli. Now, the rubrospinal tract originates from the red nucleus located in the midbrain. Axons of this tract cross the midline after leaving the red nucleus and then descend into the lateral column of the spinal cord's white matter and synapse with interneurons in the ventral horn. Like the tectospinal tract, the rubrospinal tract also terminates in the cervical region and regulates flexor and extensor muscle activity in the upper limb, helping to produce smoother and more coordinated movements. Finally, there is the vestibulospinal tract, which originates from the vestibular nuclei located in the pons and medulla just beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. Its fibers do not decussate and descend into the spinal cord, terminating and synapsing on interneurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Now, the vestibular nuclei primarily receive sensory information about the position and motion of the head. Therefore, the vestibulospinal tract functions to carry motor commands that facilitate extensor muscles of the trunk and extremities, which helps to maintain balance. Alright, now just before we wrap up, can you remember the 5 descending spinal tracts? Alright, as a quick recap, descending spinal cord pathways consist of upper motor neurons, which form tracts that transmit motor commands from the brain to the spinal cord, and lower motor neurons that directly innervate the muscles of the body. The tracts that originate from the cortex are the corticospinal tracts, which helps control the voluntary movement of our muscles. The corticospinal tract is divided into the anterior corticospinal tract, which mainly helps control the muscles of the trunk, and the lateral corticospinal tract, which helps control muscles of the limbs. The tracts that originate in the brainstem include the rubrospinal tract, which originates in the red nucleus in the midbrain, the reticulospinal tract, which originates in the reticular formation in the pons and medulla, the tectospinal tract, originating from the dorsal midbrain, and the vestibulospinal tract, which originates from the vestibular nuclei in the pons and medulla. When they say to watch your back, you really should, because there is something pretty important in there called the spinal cord. Now, if you think of a nerve as a road, then the spinal cord is a huge highway. It's a major reflex center and holds many neural tracts that connect the brain to the rest of the body, allowing for important communication to occur. The spinal cord starts at the foramen magnum, where it is continuous with the medulla oblongata, which is the most caudal portion of the brainstem. It then extends inferiorly through the vertebral canal. In adults, it usually ends at the level of the first or second lumbar vertebra. In infants, it usually ends at the second or third lumbar vertebra. The tapered end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. If we look at a transverse section of the spinal cord, we can see the anterior median fissure that extends along the midline of the spinal cord anteriorly. Similarly, the posterior median sulcus extends along the midline of the spinal cord posteriorly. The spinal cord can be divided into spinal cord segments. One spinal cord segment gives rise to the anterior and the posterior nerve roots, which come together to form a spinal nerve on each side of the spinal cord. There are 31 spinal cord segments: 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. A spinal nerve pair shares its name with the spinal cord segment it arises from. So, for example, the spinal nerves arising from the C1 spinal cord segment are named the C1 spinal nerves. Logically, the number of paired spinal nerves is the same as the number of spinal cord segments. Now, not all regions of the spinal cord are the same size. There are 2 regions that carry more fibers and are therefore wider, resulting in 2 spinal cord enlargements. The cervical enlargement spans the C4 through T1 segments. The anterior rami of the spinal nerves that arise from most of these segments form the brachial plexus, which provides innervation for the upper limbs. The lumbosacral enlargement spans the T11 through S1 segments. The anterior rami of the spinal nerves that arise from most of these segments form the lumbar and the sacral plexuses, which provide innervation for the lower limbs. Let's take a closer look at the spinal nerves. Spinal nerve roots travel laterally from their spinal cord segment through the vertebral canal to their respective opening, which for most spinal nerves is an intervertebral foramen. Just before reaching the opening, the roots unite to create a spinal nerve, which then exits the vertebral canal. Now let's look at how each pair of spinal nerves exit the vertebral column. The C1 spinal nerve exits above the arch of the C1 vertebra. Nerves C2 to C7 exit through the intervertebral foramina superior to their corresponding vertebra, while C8 exits through the intervertebral foramen between the C7 and the T1 vertebrae. Nerves T1 to L5 then exit through intervertebral foramina inferior to their corresponding vertebra. The S1 to S4 spinal nerves branch into anterior and posterior rami, and then exit through the anterior and posterior sacral foramina, inferior to their corresponding vertebra, and finally, the S5 and coccygeal nerves exit through the sacral hiatus, which is inferior to the S5 vertebra. Now, since the spinal cord only extends to the L1, L2 vertebral level, the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerve roots travel inferiorly through the remaining vertebral canal to reach their respective openings. In doing so, they form a bundle of nerve roots inferior to the spinal cord called the cauda equina. Fun fact, cauda equina is Latin for horse's tail, due to the fact that this bundle of spinal nerve roots resembles the hair of a horse's tail. There is also another important structure within the distal portion of the vertebral canal called the filum terminale. It extends from the conus medullaris and descends among the nerve roots of the cauda equina to attach to the dorsum of the coccyx, acting as an anchor for the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. Okay, now let's take a short break. Can you label these images? Now, the spinal cord and the spinal nerve roots are covered by three membranes collectively called the spinal meninges: the spinal dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The spinal meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges through the foramen magnum, and they function to support and protect the spinal cord. They also contain the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short, in which the spinal cord is suspended. Now let's talk a little bit more about each meningeal layer. The dura mater is the outermost layer of the spinal meninges. This fibrous layer forms a tubular sheath along the vertebral canal called the dural sac. The space that separates the dural sac from the bony walls of the vertebral canal is called the epidural space, and it contains the internal vertebral venous plexus surrounded by epidural fat. Superiorly, both the dural sac and epidural space extend to the foramen magnum, where the spinal dura mater is continuous with the cranial dura mater. Inferiorly, the dural sac and epidural space terminate at the level of the S2 vertebra. The dural sac is also anchored to the coccyx via the filum terminale. The dura mater also has tapered lateral extensions called the dural root sheaths, which cover the anterior and posterior spinal nerve roots that arise from the spinal cord segments. At the intervertebral foramina, these sheaths merge with the outer covering of the spinal nerves called the epineurium. The spinal dura mater is innervated by branches of the spinal nerves called the recurrent meningeal nerves. Next is the arachnoid mater, which lines the spinal dura mater and the dural root sheaths internally. It encloses the subarachnoid space, which is filled with CSF. Inferiorly, the subarachnoid space extends beyond the conus medullaris of the spinal cord. The space inferior to the conus medullaris, which extends from the L2 vertebra to the S2 vertebra, is called the lumbar cistern. It contains cerebrospinal fluid and the cauda equina. Now, the arachnoid mater is not actually attached to the dura, but rather the CSF within the subarachnoid space presses the arachnoid mater against the dura. Usually, there is no space between the two layers. However, if bleeding occurs, then blood can push them apart, creating a potential subdural space. In an anatomy lab, you might notice that the arachnoid mater is separated from the dura mater. This happens in cadavers because there is no CSF in the subarachnoid space to press the arachnoid against the dura. The arachnoid mater is separated from the pia mater by CSF, but connective tissue strands called arachnoid trabeculae make connections between the arachnoid and pia mater through the subarachnoid space. The pia mater is the innermost meningeal layer which covers the spinal cord, spinal nerve roots, and spinal blood vessels. A fine thread of the spinal pia mater forms the filum terminale, extending inferiorly from the conus medullaris. Laterally, the pia mater forms extensions along the spinal cord called the denticulate ligaments. These ligaments arise between the anterior and posterior nerve roots on both sides of the spinal cord. The denticulate ligaments have triangular processes that extend laterally and pass through the arachnoid to attach to the dura mater. Superiorly, the denticulate ligaments attach to the cranial dura mater. The denticulate ligaments, along with the filum terminale, help suspend the spinal cord in the cerebrospinal fluid of the subarachnoid space. Okay, now that we've discussed the meninges, we can take a short break. Can you recall which structures anchor the spinal cord? The blood supply for the spinal cord comes from a few sources. First, there are 3 longitudinal arteries, 1 anterior spinal artery and 2 posterior spinal arteries. The anterior spinal artery originates within the cranium from branches of the vertebral arteries. It extends inferiorly along the anterior median fissure. Its branches, called the sulcal arteries, enter the spinal cord through the anterior median fissure. The 2 posterior spinal arteries also originate in the cranium, either as branches of the vertebral arteries or the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. The 3 longitudinal arteries can only supply the superior part of the spinal cord by themselves. The circulation to the majority of the spinal cord depends on the posterior and anterior segmental medullary arteries and radicular arteries that run along the spinal nerve roots. The posterior and anterior segmental medullary arteries arise at various vertebral levels from the spinal branches of the following arteries: ascending cervical, deep cervical, vertebral, posterior intercostal, and lumbar arteries. These arteries supply blood mainly to the cervical and lumbosacral enlargements. Additionally, a branch of an inferior posterior intercostal or upper lumbar artery called the great anterior segmental medullary artery also reinforces the blood supply to the lower 2/3 of the spinal cord. Lastly, spinal branches also give rise to the radicular arteries, which are small arteries that supply blood to the spinal nerve roots and their coverings. Unlike the segmental arteries, they do not anastomose with the anterior and posterior spinal arteries. Finally, let's discuss the veins of the spinal cord. The veins of the spinal cord usually follow the arteries. There are typically 3 anterior and 3 posterior spinal veins. They drain into anterior and posterior medullary and radicular veins, which communicate with the epidural venous plexus. From the epidural venous plexus, blood flows to the dural sinuses of the cranium, the vertebral veins, and the external vertebral venous plexuses. Alright, as a quick recap, the spinal cord has 31 spinal segments and pairs of spinal nerves: 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. The 2 enlargements of the spinal cord are the cervical enlargement and lumbosacral enlargement. The spinal cord and the spinal nerve roots are covered by the spinal meninges, which consist of the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater is separated from the bony walls of the vertebral canal by the epidural space. The spinal arachnoid mater is pressed against the dura by the cerebrospinal fluid of the subarachnoid space. The spinal pia mater directly covers the spinal cord, the spinal nerve roots, and spinal blood vessels. Inferior to the spinal cord, it continues as a fine thread called the filum terminale. Laterally, the spinal pia mater forms extensions along the spinal cord called the denticulate ligaments. Finally, the spinal cord blood supply comes from the anterior spinal artery, the two posterior spinal arteries, and the posterior and anterior segmental medullary arteries, including the great anterior segmental medullary artery. Venous blood drains through 3 anterior spinal veins and 3 posterior spinal veins.